everyone. Welcome to tonight's chapter meeting. I am excited to introduce Robert Ed. And Robert Ed joins us from Darcy Solutions, and he is the Director of Strategic Marketing. He's responsible for commercialization of the technology and scaling the business. He was most recently leading strategy and marketing for an industry-leading solar photovoltaic organization and many years of experience in renewable energy and climate tech. Robert is very passionate about solving the climate crisis and improving the economy simultaneously by deploying existing technology. He joined Darcy to focus on the challenge of decarbonizing buildings, and his educational background includes a Bachelor of Science in Business and Communications and an MBA from the University of Minnesota. This presentation tonight will outline one of the new technologies from Darcy Solutions, which is groundwater-based geothermal, and why it is a fit for dense urban settings. It will also outline the improved economics for projects and why that is so crucial for lowering emissions. So with all that being said, we're thrilled to have you join us, Robert. Feel free to take it from here, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Natalie and Tim, for the introduction, and thank you to Climate Reality of Minnesota for hosting. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you. I'm going to share my screen now, and hopefully everything goes as planned here. Can everybody see that? Okay, I see a thumbs up from Tim. I appreciate the visual cue. And again, my name is Robert Ed. I'm Director of Strategic Marketing at Darcy Solutions. Darcy's a really interesting company, especially for this particular audience, because we were born out of the University of Minnesota in the development of the technology that I'm going to speak to you about tonight. And that is my alma mater. It's really exciting to commercialize the technology because we believe that it's going to have a really big impact on lowering the emissions profile associated with the built environment, which we'll talk a little bit here about now. Okay, so when you think a little bit about the built environment, and most people I find don't necessarily think a lot about the built environment. I certainly did not prior to starting to investigate climate change, but the built environment is responsible for 30 to 40% of the emissions globally. And that differs a little bit in terms of the data source you look at. If you look at the United States EIA data, it tends to cite 30%. But if you look internationally at the IEA data, you'll see a lot of references to 40%. Regardless, those are really big numbers, either one that you're going to be looking at. And so what's interesting about that is you can split those emissions up into different types. So you've got your indirect emissions. That's typically associated with the electricity that you're using in that building. Lots of different reasons you need to use electricity. Then you've got your direct emissions, so fossil fuels that are burned directly for heating, in particular heating, but cooling as well. And then there's these other emissions that there's kind of a long tail of emissions that we're trying to solve for. So if you break those down even a bit further, you can see what the categories are by end use. And so I always kind of tee this slide up with good and bad news. So the tough part about this chart is that there's so many different types of emissions to solve for. But the good news is, by and large, heating and cooling, or heating and cooling ventilation, are such a large component of that overall pie that if you have good solutions for that particular area, you're going to knock out a significant portion of those emissions. And that's what Darcy is focused on today. So how can we electrify and decarbonize the built environment? Well, there's a lot of different solutions in general, but the ones that we tend to focus on that are sought after by the Department of Energy: geothermal ground source heat pumps, is shown there on the left, air source heat pumps in the middle, and then zero emissions fuels, which are a little bit more new. They haven't necessarily been used in distribution environments. And by that, I mean, like natural gas is part of a distribution network to your house, to other buildings. If you think about it in terms of electricity, there's transmission, which would be a big pipeline of it. And then there's distribution, which would be at your local level. And zero emissions fuels has been getting a lot of interest in that recently. So we explain this to new customers in the effect that there's the first cost, there's the operating cost, and then there's a few other elements like, is it regional, and is it deployable now? So the good news about geothermal is that It's in the IRA, and we'll talk a little bit more about the economics associated with that later in the presentation. But that has effectively always been the counter argument to geothermal, is that the first cost tends to be a little bit higher than with traditional systems. And so the Inflation Reduction Act allowed for the expansion of the investment tax credit, which significantly lowers the first cost. That's really good news, because ultimately that first cost is important, particularly to organizations that don't necessarily have a lot of capital. The real interesting component of geothermal, though, is the energy efficiency of the solution. So the ongoing operating expenditures associated with that are naturally going to be lower because the energy efficiency is so high. Geothermal tends to be somewhere around 300 to 400% efficient in terms of how little energy it uses, comparatively speaking to other systems, where the coefficient of performance is going to be 100% or less. So there's naturally a good benefit to using geothermal, but that first cost historically has limited its deployment. Geothermal tends to be only 1 to 2% of the market in a given year, and we're very hopeful that we can drastically improve those numbers over the course of time. Regional is also really interesting. So if you think about air source heat pumps, what they're doing is pulling the source thermal energy from the air outside and then using that to heat or cool the inside of a building. Up here in Minnesota, when it gets really cold during those winter months, it's very challenging to use that technology to heat your building, at least on an efficiency standard that is applicable with other technologies. So that's why we put, that red X there as far as the air source heat pumps. And this is probably a good point in time too to call out the fact that Darcy is supportive of all different types of decarbonization technologies. We happen to have developed a really intriguing geothermal solution, but anything that is decarbonizing the economy is good in my eyes. And so I tend to always try to point that out, that we're supportive, even if we're pointing out the differences between specific technologies. And then finally, that zero emissions fuels, is it deployable now? That's kind of why I call out the fact that we don't really have hydrogen at scale to deploy at a distribution level to use as far as a substitute for methane. There's a lot of different ways that people talk about it in terms of blending it in with existing fuels that are used to heat the home. And again, I'm all for technologies that are lowering our emissions profile, but that's going to take a long time to develop. So for that reason, the DOE has supported ground source heat pumps as one of the most preferable technologies to be able to use. So why don't we use more of them? Why is it only 1 to 2% of the market? Well, the big reason is the fact that there's not that much land available where a lot of buildings are. And you need a significant parcel of land for traditional geothermal. Traditional geothermal is essentially taking a drilling rig and boring into the ground a 4-inch diameter bore, and then you're going to use that bore with some U pipe and put it into that bore, and you're going to actually run a conduit fluid through that and be able to use that bore to get heating and cooling out of the borehole. And typically you're going to get somewhere between 1 to 2 tons, and you're going to have to space those boreholes far enough apart such that you're not absorbing too much heat from one particular borehole considerate of the next, and that's how you get a bore field. Most buildings, as you can kind of see here, are in urban environments so close together that that parcel of land availability is really limiting. So that's one of the biggest reasons large buildings in particular don't necessarily use the technology. Okay, so what does Darcy do? We have developed a solution for geothermal exchange using groundwater as opposed to traditional substrata like that borehole that I spoke to. We build a municipal grade well, and then in that well, we're going to place a heat exchanger that was developed at the University of Minnesota, along with Darcy Solutions, who has further advanced the technology over the course of time. And below that heat exchanger, we have a submersible pump. So this is a pump that sits below that heat exchanger and cycles water across that heat exchanger continually as needed by the building to meet the thermal load. That water is running across a closed loop, and you can see the blue and red line going from the building down into that heat exchanger. That is a closed loop. So it's a big circuit of water that is continually pumped over the course of time. And that's how we provide the thermal exchange from the groundwater up into the building itself. So the groundwater that we're using to cycle across the heat exchanger is not brought up to the top of the well. It's all left down in the aquifer. We're simply trying to access the thermal mass of the substrata, and we can use groundwater to do it, which means we get access to a significant amount more thermal mass. And that's why we are able to produce significantly more capacity from these water wells than traditional geothermal borings, which are smaller in diameter and not necessarily able to use all of that groundwater to access the mass. So again, we're supporters of traditional geothermal. However, this is a great fit for dense urban environments where you don't necessarily have the land availability to put in a bore field. And for that reason, we're finding a lot of interest from the market. Okay, so with that, I want to move on to the Inflation Reduction Act, and we can answer any questions we have here after the fact. I'm trying to keep it moving relatively quickly so that we'll have plenty of time. I'm going to move through this very quickly, in particular because there's a lot of nuance to the IRA that's easy to get caught up in. So we have a notice here that basically states that the IRS and Treasury are still providing guidance on this. And so we want to make sure people looking at this deck have an understanding of the fact that some of those things that they're going to give guidance on can change. Summary of the benefits here. We've got a mocked up project, which is a new construction, 8-unit apartment complex. And it's just highlighting some of the different incentives available in the Inflation Reduction Act. Far and away, the largest is the incentive tax credit, which is shown on the top. Below that is accelerated depreciation, which is required. You are required to have a tax appetite in order to use that properly. And then the commercial energy efficiency tax deduction, or 179D, that's been around a long time. And then finally, the energy efficient home credit for 45L. So those are all significant opportunities for organizations to be able to lower the cost of these systems. And we'll get into why right now. The first is the investment tax credit. What is really critical here is that the investment tax credit was expanded to be 30% for using prevailing wages in apprenticeships. There's a 10% adder for it for domestic content. And there's yet another 10% adder for community energy areas that are transitioning from fossil fuel in a significant way and have unemployment issues that meet the guideline standards. So you could technically get up to 50% of the value of one of these systems back in the form of a tax credit if you are a commercial entity that has a tax appetite. If you are a nonprofit or a government entity that wants to take advantage of it, you're now able to do so as well via something they call elective pay. And that elective pay process is simply working with the IRS by signing up on their portal to get a unique identification number associated with your project, and then supplying that to the IRS after putting the project into service, after which Treasury will send you a payment directly from the government. So that's really interesting for some of the organizations that I know are in the audience today, including places of worship. They expanded the opportunity significantly for lots of different organizations. There's only a handful that don't necessarily have that access to it, such as federal buildings and a few others. One of the bigger areas of opportunity there are transferability as well. So now you can sell these credits to another organization, what they call transferability, whereas that didn't exist before. I can answer any questions on this. I'm just going to try to keep it moving because I know it can take some time. 179D was also expanded. It used to be $1.80 per square foot that you could access, but now you can get up to $5 per square foot. It used to be limited by certain types of technologies. Now it's expanded to all technologies, including HVAC, which I showed the Darcy system there. You can redo this every 3 years, and ultimately you're able to access this if you're a new or existing building by beating your previous efficiency numbers by 25 to 50%, or by beating the ASHRAE 90.1 standard by 25 to 50%. Again, we can talk more about that if you're interested. Here's one area that I want to explain about the investment tax credit that's really critical. There's a number of opportunities associated with it in terms of the energy property that is submitted to the IRS. So your energy property consists of all of the equipment that is necessary to generate and distribute energy within your building, and that is inclusive of the building side equipment. Now, I use a rule of thumb that the geothermal elements of a system might be 1/3 of the cost, and the building side elements of it might be 2/3 of the cost. By building a geothermal system that uses that geothermal deposit to heat or cool your building, you're able to get that same credit on the entirety of the system, which means that 2/3 of the equipment that previously you wouldn't have necessarily gotten a credit for, you're able to. And this drives incredible economics for end users if they're able to put it into practice. So I call that out because ultimately the amount of geothermal you're using for that equipment is the limiter on being able to use it. I can, again, answer questions about that. It gets pretty complicated pretty quickly, so I'll just keep moving. An example project of this, I'll just run through these really quickly and then we'll move to Q&A. A commercial building, new build, $6.4 million of HVAC project cost, 1.6 million of geothermal, and 4.8 million of related costs. So that would be the building side equipment. And then we have a 30% EUI improvement. EUI is just the amount of energy per square foot that you're using in that building. It's a traditional metric that's used in the industry. What does that look like? Well, ultimately, where initially the geothermal system would cost significantly more than a fossil fuel-based substitute, it actually comes down in cost by $2.56 million based on the credit itself, or the ITC. And then you're actually able to capture another $1.4 million in depreciation. Now, comparatively, you would have been able to depreciate the fossil fuel system a little over $1 million. So there is a difference between those two. But ultimately, you're able to lower the cost of your geothermal system very significantly, comparatively speaking, to the substitute by using the investment tax credit as well as 179D. One more quick one, a K through 12 school retrofit. This one would be $3.4 million in HVAC. The split is 1.6 million and 1.8 million. And this is at 80% of energization from geothermal. The reason that's important is because you have to prorate the value of the credit you would get for the building side equipment. Again, I won't get in depth about that, but if anybody ever has questions, happy to help. This is a similar build out of the content. You're able to see a $1.2 million credit that you would get in elective pay from the Treasury, and then a smaller 179D value. So you're able to see the original project being 3.4 million and the new cost of that project 2.1 million. So you can see the drastic amount of cost reduction you're able to capture with this incentive. All right, lastly, I get a lot of questions about, is this real? Because the HVAC industry simply hasn't dealt with it that often. Whereas I came from the solar industry and it's been in place since 2005. So I'm very used to it. And so I just showcased the amount of solar deployment that's happened since 2011 to 2022 in terms of all the different residential, commercial, and utility scale, and then the associated revenue associated with that given the ITC at the different levels that it was at. Then I showed the geothermal market and how large the geothermal market could potentially scale, mostly just to show the fact that the geothermal market is so small. People have a hard time believing that this is real, but ultimately it's not nearly as big as the solar or wind markets, which have been using the same credit for a long, long time. Okay, I'll stop there. I realize that was a lot of information. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak. Let's open it up for Q&A.
So if anyone has a question, just use the raise hand function. Robert, while we're waiting, I'll go jump to 20.
I just wonder how realistic this is if you want to reduce total CO2 emissions. Building by building, I can see saving money building by building for that entity, but I just can't see how this could possibly scale up to decrease emissions. That is, put coal out of business. It's just too complicated. How many wells will it take for a city like Minneapolis? How many wells would it take?
To be truthful, I don't have the arithmetic for how many buildings exist in Minneapolis and how many it would take to decarbonize those buildings. The idea, though, is pretty simple and straightforward. The idea is that we electrify all elements of our buildings and that we use the electricity provided by the grid if you look at the existing deployment, there's a FERC report that comes out every month that shows the amount of generation capacity that comes online. It's by far and away more and more solar and wind. Coal has gone from 400 gigawatts worth of, I think it was 500, it was 400 or 500 gigs when I first started in solar, and it's now down to 200 because of the fact that it's simply not economic to run any longer.
Okay, Tony, thank you. Let's move on to Bill. We will discuss nuclear again. We've done it several times in the past. Bill, you're up.
Okay.
Yeah, I have some questions about the technology. I think you said 1 to 2 tons per borehole using the YouTube technology. I didn't hear, I may have missed it. What is the tonnage with the heat exchanger where you're pumping the water? That's one question. And I'm wondering, are you consuming any water in this process, or is it net zero water? The water's just staying down in the aquifer. And I also, final question, I just came from a city meeting where we were talking about this referendum that passed. And one of the things they're going to do is replace the ice making equipment. I was wondering if you've heard of anything that would allow the ice making equipment to run with this kind of technology.
Thank you, Bill. Those are all great questions. To answer the first one, the 1 to 2 tons per bore, you can technically get more tonnage out of one of those bores by going deeper. We're starting to see more geothermal that's going like 800 feet. Those would be really deep wells, or boreholes, excuse me. Our wells can generate upward in Minnesota. It's different by the area that you're building, but in Minnesota, we can generate upwards of 50 tons of heat, and that's pre compression, as well as 120 tons of cooling. So it's a really powerful technology and it has a very small footprint. As far as the question on water, we do not consume any water. We do not produce water outside of the well. We're simply utilizing it in the aquifer itself and circulating it across the area that is surrounding that well.
Okay.
And then the
Joe?
question about ice making equipment.
Oh, I apologize. I missed that. Yes, I have started interfacing with some organizations specifically around ice rinks. I don't know the ice making equipment that you're asking about necessarily. Is that what you're curious about, like ice rinks or something else?
Yeah, it's an ice rink for the city of Apple Valley, and they're talking about a sled. It's an outdoor refrigeration unit that uses some refrigerant I'm not familiar with. That's what they're talking about using, and I'm just wondering if they might save money by going with something that use ground source.
Yes, we're starting to interface with an engineer who's very interested in using the technology for ice rinks. And again, you get access to this investment tax credit, which significantly improves the economics. I couldn't speak to that particular one, but I would encourage them to look into the technology. Absolutely.
Yeah, so for those looking to implement your technology, what are the major risks? What has gone wrong? What should we be aware of?
Major risks. Thus far, we're still very much at an initial deployment phase. I think the biggest thing to be concerned about is just if your site is actually applicable. And so we do an analysis to understand if the geology actually works.
Okay.
There are certain places within the state we know that it's simply not going to work. So for instance, up around the Arrowhead region of Minnesota, there's so much granite that it just doesn't have any porosity in terms of allowing water to flow through it. The productivity of a well in that area would not actually be applicable for our system. So that's the first risk. That one of the biggest areas of issues that people have ran into with traditional geothermal is improper design. So if you think about the ground that's used for traditional geothermal, it's essentially a battery of heating and cooling. And so that's one thing that people tend to be worried about with geothermal because of the fact that there's been projects where maybe it was improperly designed. We haven't had issues like that thus far, and we don't anticipate that we will have issues like that. So it's challenging for me to explain risks when I don't perceive them. But those are the main things I would be looking at in design. And we basically won't support a project that's not, going to meet the design needs. So I think I'll probably have a little bit more information in that regard in the future, maybe a year or two from now when we've seen more projects. But at this point,
Right.
we're still at a point we haven't deployed more than a dozen projects now.
Okay, so you're just at, how long have you been going?
So the company itself started in 2015. That was the LLC. Honestly, the first few years was just trying to find product market fit, and then COVID hit. So realistically, the last 2 years we settled on exactly where the technology fits the best, and that is usually large buildings. We won't necessarily do this for residential, and so since then we've expanded in Minnesota and to Wisconsin. We're currently building 8 projects. We've got another 12 expected to be put into the ground in spring of the next year. We have 35 wells active as of the end of this year, and we're quickly expanding to other states as well.
Okay, and I presume that since you came from the University of Minnesota, you had a fair amount of feasibility research before that.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. We've done lots of testing on the equipment itself. The interesting part about the technology is that a heat exchanger is, fairly, I don't want to say boring technology is not the right way to say it, but it's been used for decades. The geology and where we put the heat exchanger is what's novel. And so we're still learning continually the best way to optimize for this. But the good news is that there's nothing that can't be solved via engineering.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, Rick, I think you have a question.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. In a scenario where it's 20 below zero for a week, does geothermal have trouble catching up or maintaining temperature, or are there supplemental systems to help boost that?
It's a great question. And sorry, I see Janet, but I
Yeah.
thought there was a different name. But so interestingly, geothermal, at least Darcy's solution, is actually very good for that reason. So the aquifer temperature that we're drilling to in a well basically stays the same all year round. There might be a little bit of seasonal variation to it, but very, very little. So the temperature here in Minnesota is 52 degrees. And so we're able to use that constant temperature to meet the heating and cooling load of the building. Some of our engineering partners will put in place a backup boiler just in case of some issue were to happen. And so that's the most common use case we're seeing here in Minnesota, but it's ultimately dependent on what that building is trying to accomplish in terms of its thermal capacity, or its building loads, I should say. And so I'm not sure that fully answers the question, but ultimately geothermal is going to perform pretty well in that regard for the simple reason that you're able to access that constant temperature that's needed for the rest of the building.
Thank you.
Joe, you have a question.
Yeah. Robert, thanks again for giving this presentation this evening. I appreciate that. Kind of like I said at the commencement of the presentation this evening, I have had some good conversations with our local school district, and I kind of see it as my role to provide kind of a liaison between myself and the school district with information. So I wonder, would your Darcy Solutions website give a really nice, straightforward, easy to read, what is this, what are the costs, kind of an outline almost? Or do you have another website that I might be able to relay to them?
That's a great question, Joe, and thanks for asking. I'm actually just starting to revise our website now because it's frankly quite out of date. And unfortunately, I don't think going to it today is self-explanatory in the way that we need it to be. And so we're going to be launching a new website here early in 2024 is the goal. So I think the best thing would be, if you're genuinely interested and want to share the technology, you could certainly reach out to me. My email is just robert@darcysolutions.com, and I could try to help provide whatever information is necessary.
Yeah, that'd be great. I'd appreciate that.
Absolutely.
Thanks.
Thanks, Joe.
Thank you. Going back 40 years, I was working at a company that used the heat from computers and heat pumps to heat their building. They had a lot of trouble with maintenance. The heat pumps didn't last very long, about 12 years or so, 10 or 12 years. Are some of those issues taken care of now?
You know, I wish I could tell you that I knew the answer to that. I came from utility scale solar, and so my knowledge around HVAC equipment like heat pumps is limited at this point. I've actually got a very thick book on heat pumps I'm just about to start, but I can't really answer that honestly. I can only state that it would seem very likely that the advances in heat pump technology have been very good in the last decade in particular, because I've seen this industry organization named AHRI that has recently showcased the fact that heat pumps have actually outsold other traditional legacy technologies. And so I'd imagine that the OEMs have caught up and gotten significantly better at that. We use central heat pumps and distributed heat pumps on the building side very often in our designs. But I'd be, you know, I wouldn't be being honest if I told you I knew that they were better or not.
Okay, Tim, you're up.
I just wanted to say something to Tony real quick, just a statement to clarify things. And then I'm going to ask Robert a question or make a statement about an alternative. But Tony, we're more like 29% renewable energy use in Minnesota now, up to 33%. And when you factor in nuclear, the new speak is carbon free, and that makes it with nuclear 52% for Minnesota. So just consider that, and also consider the fact that if you started today trying to build a nuclear power plant, it would take probably 15 years to get online, and we're in a crisis. So there's all kinds of other factors there. But to Robert, there's a lot of other sources of water. As a long-time sustainable development professional, we have continuing and growing water quality problems, including groundwater. Now, where are there sources of water? Gray water, wastewater, cooling towers on top of buildings. And so my point is, Mike, I know you're still kind of moving towards scale, really entering commercialization. But what other sources of water, like I stated, might be really effective for yours?
I'm not, sorry, I apologize. I'm not sure if I understand the question. Could you repeat it?
Okay, so you're sourcing groundwater right now.
Yes. Well, we're not producing groundwater. We're using it as a conduit.
You're using groundwater. I'm sorry, you're using groundwater to get energy out of it.
Yes.
But there's other sources of water. There's gray water in all our buildings.
Oh, I
There's
see.
cooling tower water. There's wastewater, which has probably got some good energy in it, you know. And so all I'm saying is, might you adopt your technology to source those kinds?
Yeah, so that's a great question, Timothy. And there's some really interesting technologies that are using those types of effluent waters. One that comes to mind is Shark for wastewater. I mean, I'm an advocate for all of it. I would just say that as a business, you tend to focus on one technology that you can deploy and build a business out of it. And then you tend to expand into other solutions that are trying to achieve the same ends.
Right.
But no, I'm all for it. And by all means, to the earlier question about nuclear too, I'm like I said, if it is going to eliminate emissions, I'm for all the above. But to your point, we're in an urgent scenario. And so I try to focus on deployable solutions real quickly.
Well, a lot of the state funding was built on that, not renewable energy so much, renewable plus the low carbon energy. So we're, you know, it's already driving things. Hear me.
I agree.
Yep.
I'm going to try to give people that haven't spoken a chance to ask a question first. I want to put one in myself, then I'm going to go to Leon. Robert, you had mentioned that you drill one huge hole. How big is that diameter? And how many areas in the Twin Cities actually have access to the water they need where it's practical to use this?
Yeah, great question, Tim. Thank you. The diameter of the well is typically 12 inches. We've actually got heat exchangers for 8 inches, 10 inches, and 12 inches. The majority of the projects that we're building today are 12 inches, and there'll be multiple wells too. So it's not necessarily just one well. It could be, I was looking at a project down in Illinois recently, it was 30 wells. And so, that would be a real big one. The areas in Minneapolis and Minnesota generally are very good. So the majority of our state, we're blessed with great groundwater. And so most often we're able to find an aquifer that would work for our system in Minnesota. We're finding a good amount of opportunity in Wisconsin and Illinois as well. We're starting to evaluate that. But I can say Minnesota is usually conducive outside of that Arrowhead region that I already spoke to.
Yeah, thank you. Leon, you're up.
The underwater pump that is down by the heat exchanger what's the life expectancy on that? Is that a vulnerable place for failure? And how expensive is it to replace that if that pump fails? And what's your expectation on how long that pump would last, since that's a moving piece of equipment way down in the ground?
Yeah, that's a great question, Leon. We anticipate those pumps to last 10 to 15 years. They're off-the-shelf pumps, so they're not something that we build. They come from organizations that build those as part of their business. And the good news is that when they do ultimately fail, and they will fail eventually, some of them can last for 20 to 25 years, but we anticipate 10 to 15 years for a pump. When that happens, we will bring a rig in and pull the system out, and you basically can just take the system apart as you're pulling it up, and then you're just simply able to swap out that pump and put it back in. Takes about a day. I think the general costs associated with it, I'd have to go back and look that up, but it's not significant in terms of the cost of the project itself. That's pretty low in terms of O&M costs comparatively to the other technologies.
How much does this cost, Robert, versus like an earth-based ground system?
It's going to be similar in terms of price per ton. That's how they talk about these things in HVAC. It's really challenging to give you a price point associated with it because it's very dependent on the building size as well as the aquifer itself. So essentially, the deeper you have to drill, the more expensive it will be because you have to drill further. And that's the expensive part of building the system is drilling. And also the productivity of that particular aquifer. So the more water you can produce from a well, the more access to heating and cooling you have so that you're able to lower the overall cost per ton. But it really is contingent on what you're trying to do on the building side as well. And again, it's not just the cost of the well, it's also the cost of the building materials. But, generally speaking, we're in line with the traditional systems.
Yeah, but for the same site, do you anticipate the same cost or slightly lower costs than
the same site as like a traditional
like a ground source as opposed to a water source?
Yeah, and that's kind of what I meant, is that we're generally in line with those systems in terms of price point.
Okay, I know about a year ago your site was claiming much cheaper or something, or maybe a Minneapolis article was. Yeah.
And we can be. That's kind of the hard part about the aquifer. We can actually be significantly more energy efficient in terms of what we're capable of getting out of the aquifer. But it's so dependent that it's hard for me to say that carte blanche. And I think that is on our website today of, our capability to do that. And we are capable of doing it, but that's not every instance. And so it genuinely is site by site. And so I think I need to rebuild the website to explain that in a way that people can understand, because it's certainly possible to do that. And frankly, if you have a good aquifer that's at a shallow depth that you're able to access, and it's going to be extremely powerful and at a very economic way of producing that thermal energy, but it's site by site. And every customer asks the same thing. We always kind of have to explain until we've actually figured out precisely where we're going to place the heat exchanger down in that aquifer and know the rest of the balance of systems, we won't have a price point until then.
So how does it work? Do you just do a test drill first and then you get a price with no commitment, or how does that work?
Yeah, oftentimes we'll want to do a test well. And so what that is a smaller 4-inch to 6-inch diameter well that you'll temporarily case off using PVC, and then you'll use a well pump, and then you'll basically do an extrapolation of data from ramping up that pump over the course of time, and then you're going to run it for a certain amount of time to tell you how productive the aquifer can be. Because what happens when you pump water in an aquifer, you have something called drawdown. It naturally lowers that water level associated with it, and you need to run that pump for a certain amount of time to understand how the static water level is going to hold. Once you get that information, you can extrapolate that into the expected production of a full-scale well. And so that's what we'll often do.
Okay. Does anyone else have a question? We have about 5 minutes until we go to announcements. This is your chance. While we're waiting, I'll ask about network geothermal. Can we put these under a street and do a whole block?
It's a great question, Tim. There's absolutely no reason we could not use the technology for district systems or networked. There's this thermal energy networks is what they're calling them on the East Coast, or TENS. We're very interested in that market. We'd love to get active in the market. Ultimately, today, for us to operate as a business, it's a lot simpler to work through individual buildings, just because of the amount of people and stakeholders that are associated with these district systems being a challenge to predict and be able to execute project work. So I anticipate in the next 5 years, we'll get significantly more active in that, and we want to be. But today we have not really focused on it, and we're not currently building out any of those systems.
Okay, thank you. Bill, I think Bill's up.
Yeah, couple of thoughts. You were talking about how you don't consume or produce water. And if you're not consuming the water, then I wouldn't think you'd have a drawdown. And so I'm wondering, where are you pumping the water from and where are you pumping it to? Because you can't just keep using the same water. You're not harvesting water, you're harvesting thermal energy from the water and then letting the water go again. So what's the circuit? How does that go through the system?
Those are great questions, Bill. So when you pump water up through the well, you will have a drawdown, because you're essentially pulling the water in from the rest of the aquifer, and that is going to be lowering that level of water. And this happens with every well, regardless of how much you produce from it. It's just that natural pull of the water from its unagitated state. It's going to have a drawdown. And so I'm not a geologist, but our geologists could explain this very well. We've got 3 of them on staff that can explain it significantly better than a humble business person that I am. But we are not producing water out of the well. It's just a simple part of that drawdown. And I think the other part of the question I wasn't certain about.
So you're pulling the water out of the well, passing it through a heat exchanger, and then where does the water go after that?
The heat exchanger is in the well. So we're pulling water across that heat exchanger in the well, and then we're creating multiple zones, one where we're pulling the water in, and another where we're diffusing it back out into the same aquifer.
Are those vertically stacked then? So that
yes,
you pump
it's all
low
within, it's all within the well.
Okay.
Okay, Tim, are you up?
Yeah, quick question, but an important one. Do you not face regulatory constraints sourcing groundwater? And you're not actually using groundwater, you're running it through a system. But those barriers still exist, correct? And what's happening with that?
Within Minnesota, we've been working with the Minnesota Department of Health to establish a permit system, which they put into law last year. So that's simplified things a lot for us here in Minnesota. They've been a really good partner in helping us to figure out what makes sense here in the state. And so we've established that here. In Wisconsin, we're already building in that state. In others, we haven't yet established our business. So we anticipate we're going to continue to run into regulatory challenges in terms of not like it being a problem so much as just making sure they're evaluating the technology as they should, because this is a public good.
Right.
And we're able to explain it. But we do anticipate that'll become easier and easier as we have more systems deployed. Because in Minnesota, where we first started, we just didn't have very many systems deployed. And so explaining what it is and how MDH should think about it, I think initially took a little bit longer than it will in the future. But today,
What about
things are
DNR?
good.
What about the natural resource, DNR, and permitting of it?
Yeah, state by state, it's different. In Minnesota, the DNR
Right.
does not oversee that. It's
Okay.
Minnesota Department of Health.
Okay, we have time for one more question. Grant has his hand up.
Hi, so it seems like we're talking about exchanging heat in the aquifer. We could be cooling it, we could be heating it, right? What is has there been any study on doing that? It seems like this is a kind of a dilution kind of a thing, that if one building in an area has geothermal, it really doesn't affect a whole lot. But what if everyone in the area starts using geothermal? Wouldn't that actually raise or lower the temperature all at the same time? And can that have environmental effects like raising the temperature high enough to affect oxygenation or bacteria growth or anything like that?
That's a great question, Grant. That's one I get quite a bit. And the answer essentially is that there is a capacity of thermal energy within an aquifer. And for those that don't know on the call, an aquifer isn't just a body of water. It's a large rock that has porosity that allows water to flow through it. And that's generally how we build water wells, to be able to access that water that flows through it. And it's in significant volume. So if you think what I've been told, something that makes it a little easier for me to mentally digest, is that if you think about the Lake Minnetonka and how big that area is and how much water exists under it, the aquifer that's directly underneath Lake Minnetonka has 10x more water than that, which to me was just kind of like, wow, that's a really incredible amount of water. But your question is a good one. And what is the thermal capacity of that particular area that we're drawing from? I've only seen one study on it. It's from an organization that does this type of analysis nationwide and partnered with us on it. And essentially what they're trying to showcase is what is the impact on an aquifer from one well. And it was limited, but your question still is sensible. How much capacity is available? And at what point do you run into issues with too much thermal displacement? We're doing more studies around that. But the gist of what I've been explained is that it would take an incredible amount of deployment to have an appreciable effect on the aquifers within which we're operating. That said, I'm hopeful we can have a more scientific answer to that actually lays it out in clear terms, significantly better than I'm capable of here tonight.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, well, Robert, thanks for your time. It's been very, very informative. Maybe we'll give him a round of applause here for those that are on camera. Thank you. You're welcome to escape at this time, or if you want, you can stick around. We're going to have a couple business announcements. It's completely up to you. And then about 7:30, we'll just have open chat. So whatever works for you, leave when you need to.
I would love to stay, and I genuinely appreciate all the commentary, including that around. I'm very nerdy when it comes to utility scale electricity, so I love talking about all of these things. But I did hear my daughters and wife get home just now, and I should probably go talk to them a little bit. So thank you all so much for the time, and I hope that I was able to provide some answers that are interesting. Again, my email is robert@darcysolutions.com. If you have a question I didn't answer, or if you're interested in learning more about the technology, we'd be happy to provide that.